Hey, welcome back for another episode of the Downline podcast. I'm Jamie Trussell. I have the privilege of serving as the lead pastor of Redeemer Dripping Springs in the Austin area and on staff with Downline Ministries. And I'm joined today. This is really fun. So I met our guest today, now newly christened Dr. Mike Gunn. I don't remember, it was 5 or 6 years ago. We both began the same doctoral cohort there at Biola out in your neck of the woods in California. And so became quick friends and really enjoyed the time we got to spend out there. Stayed at Mike's house for 2 weeks a couple of summers ago as we were finally, the California lifted the restrictions and we could go to class in person.
Yeah.
But Mike, introduce yourself to the Downline community and kind of give them some of your background.
Sure. Yeah, as Timmy said, my name is Mike Gunn. I actually grew up in the Northeast, but I do live in Southern California and have lived on the West Coast for most of our married life. But I've been in ministry for a long time. I've been in parachurch. I worked with athletes at the University of Washington, planted a couple churches up in Seattle, and then ended up overseas for about 3.5 years. And so I think, my heart's always been in the Bible, the gospel, and culture, and how the intersection of those things happen. That's been something for quite a long time. And then even going overseas is part of that, learning not only different cultures, but how does the gospel intersect in a different place. It's always been on my mind, always been something that's been interesting to me. And so,
You left off. Hey, Mike, you left off Boston College football legend.
I did. It's weird. I did because I actually had a good year this year, or at least a decent year, I should say. I played football at Boston College. My goal actually was to play in the NFL. I played a few games in what was called the AFA, which became the USFL. That was a goal, and that's part of my testimony too, because of injuries and everything else. Kind of stunted that goal in my life. But I've been actually a football coach for probably close to 30 years. It's off and on because of travel and all, but yeah, it's a major part. And it's, playing at BC was a thing because where I'm from, that's kind of I'd say the biggest Division I school in the area. And so it was great. It was a great time. My 4 years weren't the best. Flutie came in later and put us on the map. So that was cool.
Yeah, you're a pre-Doug Flutie.
I am. Literally the year before. All my three of the sophomore, junior, sophomore classes played with him, and it was obviously a great time with playing with him. So
yeah, for sure. Okay, so Mike, 2021. So let me tell, if some people are listening, are kind of going, well, I feel like I've heard that name before. Well, I didn't even know this till we got into our doctoral cohort, but Mike, you were one of. So if anyone listened to that kind of phenomenon of a podcast that really swept through the evangelical Christian community, the rise and fall of Mars Hill, which is, began in 2021. There's mentioned in one of the episodes, the 3 founding pastors of Mars Hill. Mm-hmm. So it's Mark Driscoll, Leaf Moy, and then they throw out this guy's name, Mike Gunn. And so you've been kind enough to come on and kind of talk to me and with me about those early years. Now, let me set the table for our listeners on what this is and is not. And so obviously, and there's going to be a part 2, Mike and I will talk about kind of the phenomenon of why that podcast we think was so addictive, is maybe for lack of a better word. But when I asked Mike to come on, it wasn't to kind of do Mars Hill, the other side of the story, or, hey, what really happened? Or, Mike, what do you think about Mark Driscoll? None of that. It is the fact that I'm really interested, Mike, in how the church got started and what those early days were like, and what you saw as a church planter in Seattle in, what is that, the mid to late 90s, and what even attracted you to that work to begin with, and maybe some things you learned about yourself, church planting, what God did in and through that church in its early stages. Because on the podcast, we didn't get a lot about, well, the positive things God accomplished. I know there are lots of people that were wounded, and that's no invalidation of anything that happened through that, but also no real insight. Man, how do 3 guys get together and launch such a church that played such a big part in the evangelical landscape? You just don't think that's going to happen in Seattle. To be honest with you, those things happen in Dallas and Houston and other places. So I want to hear more of that. I first listened to this podcast before we, well, no, we'd already met. We were well into our bio degree, but I was late night putting together an IKEA dresser for my daughter. This is what, like 5 years ago, 4 years ago, something like that. And I told Mike, I told my wife, here's my retirement plan. I'm going to put a counseling center across the street from every IKEA store in the country because nobody leaves that place in a better spot than when they arrived. So,
Very true.
uh, that being said, Mike, talk us through just those early days. You're doing ministry at the University of Washington. How on earth do you end up planting what came to be known as Mars Hill?
Yeah, it's a lot there. So I'll start. Yeah, I moved up to Seattle in end of '93. So literally 2 days after Christmas, we were took a truck, took my two little kids, moved up to Seattle. I became part of Athletes in Action, which is we had a great ministry up there and all. It was really looking back on all of this. It's really looking at a fond time, to tell you the truth. And so for me, I'm going in. I was a pastor of a church, but I was like a youth and family pastor. I was my late 20s, early 30s, and I'm going into this parachurch, and I've always felt it from an ecclesiological point of view that the church is what God's given, the world, and missions is the church is important. So it's always been an importance to me. I believe in the parachurch and how they can help and come alongside, but church was mattered to me. So immediately we went to find a church, and it was interesting because where we lived at the time was not a very diverse area. We ended up planning a church later that wasn't a diverse area. But I also knew I was going to be working with athletes, and the reality of it is about 50% of athletes in a college campus are African American or at least not white. And so we had heard about this church of a guy that played for the Seattle Seahawks. And that interested me anyways, just because, hey, it's a football player. And he's an African-American guy, actually played, he played for the Dallas Cowboys. He was in the, I think it was that 75 Super Bowl, the one that Lynn Swan made that amazing catch. But anyways, he was in that. And he planted this church, and this church was very diverse, particularly from an ethnic and racial point of view. It wasn't necessarily social economic because it was on the other side, what we call the other side of the water, which is just usually whiter and nicer and a lot of money over there. And so, but I thought, if I'm going to bring students, I want to have a church that, they can see people they look like too. So we went there. First day I was there, I went right up to the pastor. That church is about 1,500, but he was always available. And I went up to him. I said, "Hey, I'm new. I'm working with athletes, and what can I do here?" He goes, "Hey, we got this new intern, young intern, just graduated from Washington State, named Mark Driscoll. He's gonna start this college ministry." I said, "Okay, sure, perfect. I'm doing college ministry. That's when he's going to start." So we did, and it really, went pretty well. But
Yeah.
Mark and I lived on the other side of the water, and we didn't live in that community. And Seattle proper is way different than the other side of the water. So we really felt as we were building that ministry that we need to do something on the other side of the water. And so Mark actually started a Bible study in his home, and and that really began to grow. Mark probably has all the numbers right off the top of his head. I'm sure some of them embellished. I'm not sure, but it grew. It definitely did. And
Pastors don't embellish. We don't embellish. We don't make things up.
Exactly. So he got a hold of somebody that got us a room in a church across the street from the Seattle Zoo. So we started what was called the Zoo Crew. That was all it was called, because we're across the street from the zoo. And that actually started growing, as did the other group. But this one was different. And it was something that Mark, I think, could put his label on, because when you're in a church, there's a lot of things you can and can't do. This one was very much, I think, connected to a lot of what Mark and I had been talking about. And that was, how do you engage, particularly the Seattle culture, in which Mark would be quick to tell you is the number one unchurched city in America. It's liberal, all that stuff. And how do you engage that? And at the time, the grunge scene is taking off. Tooth and Nail became this really big music publishing company. There's a lot of bands out of Seattle, tons of them. And Mark was of the age, and I wasn't that much older either, of going to these clubs and seeing some of these bands.
Hey, hold
Help
on,
me
let's do
gauge
a
that.
walk. Let's do a walk down memory lane. Seattle grunge bands in the '90s. Is that Nirvana? I mean, Nirvana come
Well, you
out of
got
there?
Nirvana and Pearl Jam, Mother
Yeah.
Love Bone. You have Alice in
Okay.
Chains.
Hey, Alice in Chains, yes. No one's ever heard of Mother Love Bone.
Well, that's because their lead singer died, and they formed a band called the Temple of the Dog, and
I've
that
heard of that
was
one.
a mishmash of Mother Love Bone. It actually what I think created ultimately Pearl Jam, because the Pearl Jam members kind of
Yeah.
connected. There was a few people that connected to create really just one, what I'd say, great album.
Okay.
And
Okay. Yeah.
so
Pearl Jam has one really good album.
yeah, it's 10, and I think that's what most people think. I would say it's definitely their best for sure.
Yeah.
And and
All right. Hey, I sidetracked us. That's a deep dive. I didn't mean to
well,
sidetrack us, but
we
yeah,
just had
tons
many.
of bands.
Screaming Trees were another one. I mean, it's just a lot of good
Yeah.
bands, and
Yeah.
there was clubs everywhere. And so so our time with the Zoo Crew is we'd have a band playing and then preaching. So it was kind of band and preaching, nothing else.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of times the band. I think sometimes the band was even secular. So it was just like, hey, here's the band, but there's preaching after. And it started connecting, I think, Mark particularly to the music scene a lot. And so what was going on is they had a lot of these underage clubs in Seattle, like a lot of them, and they were really kind of big. And in fact, Mother Jones did a really good article on us early on, because a lot of those clubs were closing. There was a lot of issues in those clubs with drugs and sex and a bunch of stuff. So Seattle was starting to close them. So we started a different nonprofit to really restart those clubs. And so Leaf, who came in later, and I'll get to that part. Leaf came into, it was me and Mark at first, and then Leaf came in later.
Okay.
Bought a theater right near the U District, and it basically reopened the all age venues in Seattle. And I have, as much as I think Seattle Times and everything would have bad things to say about Mark and Mars Hill, not the early days. I have the articles that I still have them, where it was very, very positive. I remember even when Eddie Vedder and a lot of those guys were doing the music experience, which is this huge thing in Seattle, and they were starting to do some things with all age venues that we had done well before them. I mean, I would have to say Mars Hill was, well, if not Mars Hill at the time, but Mark Driscoll and some of the stuff we did was instrumental in that. So there was this engagement with a culture that was, people were going, what is this? I mean, we had churches that didn't even like us because you're engaging with the wrong people.
Yeah.
And so as that grew, I always felt, hey man, I'd love to do this coffee shop and have bands and there's actually a club up in Seattle that we were gonna like model it after and all, but yet have these dynamic conversations and dialogues around Christ, and just really bring the gospel into that arena. And at the same time, I'm starting some ministries too that doing the same thing in different arenas. And so we really thought that's something we could do, until we realized we don't have any money and we don't know what we're doing. So we're like, oh, that's not so cool. And I'd say then we were reading a lot of Leslie Newbegin and Francis Schaeffer, and really felt, we need to plant a church, which we also didn't know what we were doing, to tell you the truth. And so we just started talking about it. We came up with the values and all that. We just started saying, this is what we want in a church.
And are you still with Athletes in Action and doing all this?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much the entire time until I planted my second church. So Mars Hill is all within that time. And so it was a really crazy, awesome time, because it was kind of just, thrown out there. We had, I think Mark is really smart, and he knew what he was doing. I think the thing that Mark did well, and still does, he connects with his culture from a speaking point of view as good as anybody. I'd say
Mm.
Keller did that too in New York, but Mark really understood his culture, his people.
Mm.
At
Mm.
that time, the Gen X, that was, we didn't have Z and Y, or it was like Gen X, and he
Yeah.
understood it, and he spoke well to it, and he spoke hard to it, but at the same time, they were hearing it, and so
Mm.
we started in 2000, no, the beginning of 2002. Excuse me, I'm sorry, that's when I planted mine. In 96. So we had been a couple of
Right.
years of, doing the college ministry and all that. So in January 96, we had our first, it wasn't even a service, it was just a bunch of people that met in the same room as a zoo crew to start what would be look more like a church service. But
So what in that? So you launched that kind of, looks more like a church service. What's your kind of day one role as y'all start to more formalize planting an actual church?
yeah, again, it was just me and Mark at this point in time.
Right.
And so I was always concerned, still am to this day, about the Bible and teaching it and that sort of thing. I think that's some of my
Yeah.
giftedness, and so and Mark is too. And Mark, so we were both like theology guys. So we created right away like an institute, and that people could get
Mm.
a lot of good theology classes.
Sure.
And so one of my main roles was that.
Yeah.
I was one of the two, really two. It was me and Mark that did the classes. I also did about anywhere from probably 25 to 35, 40% of the preaching kind of early on.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, but Mark, that was definitely something Mark was going to do, and I knew that. I mean, even as a planner, he's going to be the main guy there. But I was going to
Yeah.
be the guy that's going to help with the theology and the training and the discipleship, because that's what I was doing on campus too.
Right.
And
Right.
since I was already doing that, so that was my main thing. I like I said, I started a couple ministries too, especially early on with Mars Hill. One was a climbing ministry because I climbed,
Oh
um,
yeah.
and another one was film and theology. Um,
Mm.
which again, it really hit that culture well,
Oh yeah.
because everyone was into the arts and
Yeah.
film
We
and
didn't have a lot of
discussing that.
film and theology classes growing up in Alabama.
Yeah,
That
maybe
did not hit.
maybe
Yeah.
not,
No,
but yeah,
that didn't
football
hit the
class
bug.
maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. So what
So
here's what's interesting to me. Obviously I've known you for some years now is yeah, I guess I've only known you in this life stage, but I mean you're kind of like this gentle giant. Like yes, you got a lot of opinions and thoughts on things, but there's a humility and a gentleness and a real like pastoral concern for people, which obviously, as we saw things play out in latter years, would be a pretty good antithesis to kind of what we saw some of the things turn into at Mars Hill that you helped plant. What have you always been like that? Were the dynamics similar kind of as y'all got started, or did you kind of always see, okay, I'm more like this, he's more like this? How did that interpersonal dynamic play out?
yeah, that's good. That's a really good question. I appreciate the thoughts. I think some people would think opposite. It just depends who you talk to. But
Mm.
I really,
You're really old and more gentle now, I'm sure.
yeah, I mean, definitely different now.
No.
I was an athlete, so I was always competitive. And I think that did come out sometimes.
Mm.
But Driscoll, in his book says something like, uh, Gunn spoke or preached like a football coach, and that's like, yeah, it's probably pretty true.
Mm.
Um, I was always intense. So some people take intensity differently,
Sure.
but I think on the back of my mind, I was always trying to, how should we approach this as pastors? And I
Mm.
look at the qualifications of an elder and a pastor. You know, humility and gentleness. Some of those things are very, very key. And so it's kind of funny when I'm looking back on it. I think overall that's probably pretty true. But there was times I'm sure someone can say, "Hey, man, he really came down on me." And I
Yeah.
know I can look back on some of those times and it's like, yeah, I would have changed some of those things. But it wasn't. I think my normal pastoral heart was generally there,
Yeah.
and and I've always cared about people, anyways. That's just something that was really
Mhm.
important to me, and and I feel like when I'm in a room with people, part of it's people pleaser, but part of it is if I'm going to hurt somebody, I want to make sure it's done for the right reason, or they're hurt for the
Yeah.
gospel or something like that.
Yeah,
not
well, you even
for,
see Paul writing to the church at Corinth. He's like, I really don't want to come deliver this message because it doesn't bring me joy to watch myself inflict this
yeah,
painful talk on you.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's an interesting passage I've always loved. So,
yeah.
yeah, I
So,
think we did have different personalities for sure,
yeah,
and I
and you saw
probably
that early
buffered
on.
him. Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, you could see. I'm looking back at everything now and what people have said and all that. I'm like, okay. I mean, I can I certainly can say sure. You can see some of that stuff, but I would say early on, a lot of stuff did not come out. At least not come out from the things I've heard.
Yeah,
Mark was always straightforward. I always love that. I'm from the Northeast. I love when
sure.
someone tells me,
Yeah, y'all aren't nice to anybody.
yeah, I double barrel down my eyes. I'm good with that. So that never bothered me, and we definitely had times where he took some shots. I mean, I'm talking, as guys do in a room, and
Sure.
for me, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to punch back. I mean, it's like, I didn't take that necessarily as anything other than a young guy just, firing something, telling me what he really thinks
Hmm.
about whatever the conversation was. So,
When
it
y'all
was
launched,
positive.
Mike,
Hmm.
did y'all launch with elders, or was it just kind of you and Mark were calling all the shots, or was there an additional layer
Great,
of
great
leadership
question.
in place?
Yeah, that's a great question. Mark was always concerned about a couple of things. One is that it didn't look that way, and two, that he was young, and we were college students. I mean, we first started, and so it's like I think he felt like even though he was whatever 26 by then or 27, whatever, that is he going to be respected? He had no kids at the time, and so that was a big deal for Mark, and so in the meanwhile, he was starting to do a radio program with Leaf Moy, and that's where Leaf Moy comes into the picture. And so
Oh,
by the time we started Mars Hill, Leaf Moy was one of the three. But the
okay.
2 years prior, it was just he was a guy that was doing radio, Christian radio, but they had a really interesting show. And I
In
was on it a
Seattle, like
couple
a
times.
local show in Seattle, or was
Yeah,
it okay?
actually, I think they might have gone national
Huh.
for a while. It's a money issue, so I know that it was back and forth. But they had a really
Yeah.
cool show, and there was a lot of people calling in. So Mark also had that. So when we started, it was the three of us, and actually there was five of us on the time before we launched. We launched October 6th, 2000. That's my launch. October 6th, 96. From
Okay.
January to October, we were building up. There were five guys, two of them from that church that we went to called the Antioch. They
Yeah.
decided on launch day that they were going to go back, after launch day. So it was me,
Okay.
Mark, and Leaf.
Uh-huh.
But prior to that, Mark set up a team of local pastors. And it's almost like a joke, but it was like a Lutheran, a Baptist, um, I think like a non-denominational and EV free guy. And there was at least one more on that panel. And what Mark held was an open dialogue. Those guys had grilled us a lot theologically because they were going to, in a sense, ordain us. We were
Mm.
non-denominational, but Mark wanted this idea that, look, we're not just making stuff up, or we're not two guys that are just we don't know what we're doing
Yeah.
theologically. So what we did is we went through a process with them, and then we had like a 2 hour, maybe 3 hour session where anyone that wanted to come was public. It was right before one of those night sessions.
Okay.
And they threw out questions. It was interesting because Presbyterian, that was another one, because Presbyterians, Lutherans, Baptists, and EV Free, they have a little bit different theological beliefs, even
Yeah.
though they're evangelicals. And so we had to answer questions from different points of view, which I thought was kind of cool. And the panel didn't, they weren't debating us. It was more like they wanted to hear, could we
Mm.
theologically hold the weight of what we believed? And so it was
Sure.
that panel that ultimately signed off on an ordination that was Mark and I. Um,
Okay.
and then, like I said, Leaf came in the picture shortly after that. So
Yeah. So y'all launch, you kind of have that leadership dynamic. I guess from early on, did you feel like there was good present accountability just interpersonally between the two of you or the three of y'all? Or was there a certain point where you started going, I something feels off here?
No, I think it was pretty good. Actually, the other thing we did was we created a ministry team really quickly. So they weren't pastors of the church, but there were about 3, 4 other people. That a couple of them became elders pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's
But
great.
that was part of our training process of elders. But there was 3 of us. We had an interesting dynamic because Mark, Leaf, and I were very different from one another. And I would say Mark and Leaf connected a little bit more. They ended up they were younger, and they do vacations together and that sort of thing. So I think they were a little more connected. But we had some meetings that were always, we were all opinionated. So there was tension, but not real super bad tension. And I think we played off each other pretty well
Yeah.
at that point. And we did have a ministry team too. And so it was kind of a collective unit with Mark clearly being the leader of leaders kind of thing.
Hmm.
And so, but I just really think early on, I know this changed. I know that's part of the deal. My friends were part of the end of Mars Hill. Mark was a little bit more collective back then.
Yeah.
That he would listen, listen to me, and when he told me, I didn't think I was full of it, he would tell me, but he would listen, and I think he listened to that team, and it wasn't
Mhm.
so bad, and we did so much together too. We had like softball games together. We just did stuff, and everyone
Yeah.
was hanging out. The early times was people hanging out, playing. I think we played tackle football, which I try to stay away from after my my career. But
I would, yeah.
uh, uh,
I
but
would
it,
say that with you. I remember when we were out there a few years ago, yeah, you were putting me through like a sparring session in
yeah,
your backyard.
yeah, it's one thing I love it. Boxing
Yeah.
drills, man, it's awesome. So
But
so
what
yeah,
was that like early on though? Like, what did you love about planning that church? Because I think from the outside looking in, the narrative kind of goes, "Wow, church grew insanely quickly, massive, mega church, like hard to replicate." Though, but like, was there a season there where you felt like, I mean, we were kind of a smaller, intimate, local church, really being able to do life together, or did it get too big too quick?
I'd say it got big pretty fast, but there was a time frame. We didn't have a building or anything, so every time
Where
we'd
were y'all
grow.
meeting? In that theater that y'all bought,
Started
or
started in the zoo crew, went to a place down another place. It's out by the University of Washington, and then we ended up at downtown. It's just a downtown site, and then
okay?
when they created the Paradox Theater, that's when things started to change. And so
Hold on,
what
what is
happened?
a Paradox Theater? Is that a Seattle venue, or did y'all build that,
That's
or
the venue that Leaf bought and created the music venue. So it
okay?
was it was an old theater that had been shut down, and Leaf bought it and created the Paradox. So that was a big thing. But when we were downtown, it was just one service at night. The venue was a Presbyterian venue, and it was huge, like one of those old Presbyterian, had the upstairs and came around.
Oh,
It was probably at least 1,200, I would guess, and we were 150, maybe 200,
okay,
and we might even get up to 300. But 300 in that venue looks like
nothing.
nothing.
Is that mostly college students?
I say mostly college students. I started bringing students, and we were growing, but it was this vacuous place that sound was echoing. And I
Yeah.
remember we'd come in, and at that time, the music, the whole goth thing, and we had candles, and it was dark, and half our people were dressed in black, and so I remember coming into those meetings, and Leaf Moy would go in. If I have to sit through one of those one more time, I'm gonna kill myself. It was just so macabre. It was so like, oh my gosh, we are Seattle,
Hmm.
and then it was a big empty room, and so it's just funny, crazy things. Homeless people would come out, and one guy came out and he's screaming and yelling at Driscoll and telling him that God told him that he's going to hell. I mean, it was just nuts. And so yeah, there was times we go, where are we going with this? And then college students were moving on, and are we going to grow? I mean, what do we have for a church? That
Mm.
was all part of it. I'd say major
Hey,
part of it.
with a
And
bunch of college students, I'll tell you what you didn't have was any money. You couldn't have bought a Yoo-Hoo and a Jolly Rancher with those ties.
yeah, I think one of our offerings were like $4.50 or something. I'm not kidding. We're sitting there going, we don't have any money. I mean, none. I mean, we had some coming in from Antioch, but that was enough to pay Marcus' salary. So it was kind of crazy. And when we started the Paradox, though, everything kind of changed because now we had a venue. And so
Mm.
we did two venues, South Seattle and that place. We had the Paradox, and then we found a venue over by Seattle Pacific University. And that is what exploded the place. A
Mm.
very small venue. Matter of fact, no parking. This was very
Okay.
interesting. So what Mark did in August, I was 2 weeks before 9/11. Matter of fact, I remember end of August. I was in New York
Okay.
City. Mark calls me and says, "Hey, man, look, we've been doing the Paradox. I think two, maybe three services. I don't remember. We're doing downtown, but now we got this building." Mark said, "Look, I'm going to go over to the building. That's me. I'm going over there. Leaf's going to take the Paradox. It's his spot." And that had by then it had probably 400 people. It grew,
Oh,
and
yeah. Was it
then
me
you
in the
can
morning or still at night?
that meant in the morning, I believe.
Yeah. Okay.
Might even had a night one too. They had a few services. And then I took the south one, but we didn't have that building. We had another building. So we had three services, all Mars Hill, but I was kind of the lead in
Mm.
one in Leaf. Well, when Mark went, pretty much the 400 followed him because it was
Oh,
close
wow.
enough. Mine was
Yeah.
further south. And
Yeah.
so at that point in time, they eventually stopped the Paradox, and that other venue grew, and it grew a lot. I mean,
Mm.
and it couldn't house the people. We had
Okay.
police almost weekly there because neighbors complaining that it's a neighborhood church, no parking.
Mm.
It was probably some old church 50, 60 years ago that, X amount of people went to and walked from their homes. And it was crazy. And it was just, it was growing, like crazy growing. And uh, so much so, like I remember we had a busload of people from Kansas City come in to see
Okay.
what we're doing.
Yeah.
I remember I got to speak in all these different places in New York and all these different places, and people are, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Not sure. I'm not sure what we're doing." We basically we're heavy preaching,
Yeah.
and the music we have. Well, it started off horrible. I was the answer to the question of who's the first worship guy was me. I can't sing, so I didn't really. I just,
I did not know that.
yeah. Well, I didn't. I had to have someone sing. I mean, it was. Well, I'll tell you what. I think we did it for 2 weeks. Mark came up to me after the service and said, "You guys really stink." He goes, I don't want you to do it anymore." I was like, "Yeah, it's true. We do." Um, and so we didn't do music. And so, but within 1 week, some guy came and he said, "Look, I do music," and he was phenomenal. He was a music
Oh,
guy for a
wow.
few years, and so
Yeah.
and so our music was really good for the Seattle scene.
Mm.
I think for some people, my friend when I was in Turkey, he was from Texas, and that kind of music does not make him worshipful. Let's put it that way, but it did for
Watch it now.
Seattle. But
Watch it now.
so, it grew up, and then we got into a larger building, and that's when it really just took off. I think when I planted the second church, we were um, we were at least 1,500 by then,
Okay.
and that was
Okay.
pretty fast.
And so you were, I mean, 96 to 2002. So,
2001 was when I took the other. Yeah, 2002
okay.
is when I launched. Yeah,
So let's say a good 5-year run as a founding pastor. Uh, at what point did you start thinking, you know what? I think I want to plant my own church, or I think God's got something else for me. What began that kind of disruption in you? And was there anything that you were sort of like, I think I want to change of environment?
yeah, it's a really good question. So we were doing I don't know how many services, man. It was a lot, and so because I was still Mars Hill, but I was the South
Yeah.
Service. The Paradox had closed and gone to the big church, but they were doing, I don't know, I think Mark was doing 5 services up there and I was doing one. I mean, when
Oh
you,
my word.
sometimes I would preach all of them. Mark usually preached up in what we call Big Ballard.
Yeah.
But when you did, it was just like, it might have been 6 services. I don't know. It was a lot. And, and I think for me, first of all, we were pretty far away from the main church, and we were drawing from even people further away. That was part of
Mm.
it, but part of it was I have some different views regarding just things that the church should be about. And it
Hmm.
wasn't it wasn't a clash, but it was different. It was clearly going to be different. And
Gotcha.
when we got into what we call Big Ballard, the big building, it was very evident that things were going to change quite a bit. And
Okay.
and so I
What
just
were some of those shifts going to be? I mean, obviously, the nature of large church and smaller churches, things are inherently different. But what were some of the shifts you saw?
yeah. Well, one of my big beliefs is that the church is when you look at the gospel, I see two sides of a gospel. I see the power of the gospel, that's the preaching of Jesus. That's the gospel is about Jesus.
Hmm.
But there's the implications of the life that we're called to live, the mission of God. And
Sure.
I believe a lot of that has to do with how we treat the poor, that kind of stuff, and that the church ought to be connected to those type of things within the culture. And I also believe that the church needs to reflect the diversity of its area. I mean, you can't
Sure.
expect certain people if they don't live there, but
Sure.
certain, and that's also social economic. That's not just race or ethnicity or anything like that. And so we were in an area that was way more diverse.
Hmm.
And we actually ended up in an area that was, my kids' school was about 65% people of color, non-white. So we were in a very diverse area, and we were in an area that had a lot of homeless and some gang issues and things of that nature. And I just felt that the church needs to be kind of part of that, to engage that, to in many ways. And
Okay.
I think it's not like Mark did not like that or did not want that, but that wasn't going to be an emphasis.
Yeah.
I think that was part of it, and all. And Mark says in his book that, hey, we're both leaders, and I need to do my own thing. That's part of it. I can be a second. I really don't have any problem with that,
Hmm.
um, as long as I'm feeling I'm using my gifts, I guess.
Sure.
Um, but I think a lot of it became some philosophical differences. Um, for the main philosophy of what we were doing.
Okay.
So, and we were kind of a little bit further away, and so we planted with a well, we started off as Mars Hill and really changing things, but then we planted with a real, I'd say, different philosophy altogether.
Yeah. And
So
you did that church plant for how long?
10 years.
That was 10 years. And then did you go from that church plant down to California?
No, I was 3 years in Turkey.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And by the way, coaching American football in Turkey.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. That's how we
You're a
stayed there.
trailblazer.
Yeah, to be able to stay there, you had to have, you had to have a reason. So
Yeah.
to get residency and all that. So yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
did for a job that didn't
Mm.
pay, but a job. And so yeah,
We call
so
that ministry. Did you say a
yeah,
job that doesn't pay?
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So
Hey, look, I'm going to stop it there. This is going to kind of be a part one. Thanks for just opening the door up a little bit and kind of showing us how God used you and how it was early on. And, as a current, I would maybe sort of church planter ish pastor out here in Austin, it's encouraging to me to hear kind of what happened and how you reach people. And I love, and we'll do a later episode this spring at some point, kind of a part three, but just how you take the cultural context and intersect it with the gospel is, I think you have a real gift for that. So at some point we're going to do a third episode and let you kind of bring some of your insights on that. But I'm going to leave it there, Mike. And
cool.
thanks so much for your time. Miss you. Tell your wife I said hello.
Definitely. Thanks so much, bro. Love it.